When we think of the office of President of the United States, many different things come to mind. Some good, some bad, and some downright ridiculous. One thing that probably doesn't immediately spring to mind is cheese. However, the White House has been home to not one, but two enormous cheeses, and one of those cheeses stayed for over a year. Hey there, cheese historians! I'm Julia, and this is Cheese History, a channel all about the origins, history, and impact of cheese. Today, we're looking at the curious case of two enormous cheeses that were given to two US presidents, Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, by their adoring supporters, who were also cheesemakers. You might be wondering, why would anyone make an enormous cheese for anyone, let alone their nation's leader? How would they transport such a cheese all the way to Washington, especially in the days before trucks and planes? And what would anyone, especially a president, do with so much cheese? To find out, let's start with the cheese made for Thomas Jefferson. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson was sworn in as the third president of the United States. In the town of Cheshire in Berkshire County, Massachusetts, Baptist minister John Leland was thrilled. He had met Jefferson in Virginia and had been impressed by what he saw of the founding father of the United States. Back in Cheshire, Leland campaigned hard from his pulpit to convince his congregation to vote for Jefferson in the upcoming presidential election. When Jefferson was indeed elected to the presidency, Leland suggested to the people of Cheshire that they should make an enormous cheese as a gift to the president to show their support. On a set day, the 20th of July 1801, everyone who owned a cow was to bring the curds made from their milk to the town's cider mill, where an enormous cheese press was set up to make the cheese. An enormous hoop had been prepared and placed upon the bed of the cider press, which had been well purified for the work, and covered with a false bottom of the purest material. The hoop, resting on this, formed a huge cheese box, or segment of a cistern, and was placed immediately under the three powerful wooden screws which turned up the massive head block above. A committee of arrangement met the contributors as they arrived and conducted them to the great white shallow vat, into which they poured their contingents of curd, from the large tubs of the well-to-do dairyman to the 6-quart pail of the poor owner of a single cow. When the last contribution had been given in, a select committee of the most experienced dairy matrons of the town addressed themselves to the nice and delicate task of mixing, flavouring and tinting such a mass of curds as was never brought to press before or since. But the farmers' wives of Cheshire were equal to the responsibility and duty of their office. All was now ready for the coup de grace of the operation. The signal was given. The ponderous screws twisted themselves out from the huge beam overhead with even thread and line, and now the whey ran around the circular channels of the broad bed in little foamy bubbling rivers. The machinery worked to a charm. The resulting cheese was a Cheshire cheese, the town of Cheshire being named after the county of Cheshire in England where Cheshire cheese originates. The Cheshire cheese made in Cheshire, Massachusetts, measured more than 4 feet, 1.2 meters in diameter, 13 feet, 4 meters in circumference, and 17 inches, 43 centimeters in height. Once cured, it weighed 1,235 pounds, 560 kilos. The weight seems to be disputed, as other sources say it weighed 1,600 pounds, or 726 kilos, but that could be its weight before it was fully aged, as some types of cheese dry out as they aged, particularly cheeses like Cheshire. Regardless, it's a huge cheese. It was so big that its makers didn't want to risk transporting it in a wagon or cart in case all the bumps and jolts it would face during the journey would damage it. Instead, they waited for winter and sent it to Washington first by ship and then by sleigh, a journey of 500 miles, around 805 kilometers, and it took 3 weeks. Elder Leland was sent along to oversee the cheese's journey to Jefferson. He recorded his travels with the cheese very briefly. In November 1801, I journeyed to the south, as far as Washington, in charge of a cheese sent to President Jefferson. Notwithstanding my trust, I preached all the way there and on my return. I had large congregations, led in part by curiosity to hear the mammoth priest, as I was called. The press eagerly followed the journey of Leland and his cheese, which arrived in Washington on the 29th of December 1801. On January 1st, 1802, Leland presented Jefferson with the mammoth cheese, as it had by that time become known. Jefferson received the gift, and because he had a strict policy of declining gifts, insisted on paying $200 for the cheese, which was about 50% more than the cheese was worth. The mammoth cheese was also apparently inscribed with "the greatest cheese in America for the greatest man in America." Jefferson cut a wedge from the cheese and gave it to Leyland to take back to the people of Cheshire so they might share the fruits of their labour, or in this case, the cheese of their labour. The cheese was also served to those present. It was a beautiful annatto colour, a little variegated in its appearance, owing to the great variety of curds composing it, and as it was served up to the company with bread, all complimented it for its richness, flavour and colour, and it was considered the most perfect specimen of cheese ever exhibited at the White House. And that is basically the story of the first huge cheese to grace the White House. Leyland's mammoth cheese presented to Jefferson may have inspired the second enormous presidential cheese, which was gifted to President Andrew Jackson, the 7th president, in 1835. The cheese presented to President Jackson was made by Colonel Thomas S. Meacham from the small town of Sandy Creek in Oswego County, north of New York. The cheesemakers of Sandy Creek had supplied Jackson with cheese throughout his presidency. Led by Meacham, they decided that he had to have everything that Jefferson had, and preferably better. The cheese made for Jackson is said to have been a cheddar weighing 1,400 pounds, 635 kilos, 4 feet, 1.2 meters in diameter, and 2 feet, 61 centimeters thick. Bigger than the cheese gifted to Jefferson, assuming the smaller size of 1,235 pounds for the Jefferson cheese. Written on it was, "Our Union, it must be preserved." Once made, Meacham transported the cheese at least part of the 300-mile, 483-kilometer journey from Sandy Creek to Washington in a wagon pulled by 24 horses. The South Branch Intelligencer described the arrival of the cheese to the White House like this: "A monster. A Colonel Thomas S. Meacham of Sandy Creek, Oswego County, New York, has presented General Andrew Jackson a cheese which weighs 1,400 pounds, made from the dairy of Colonel M, consisting of 154 cows. The general made no scruples in receiving this monster to his own household. He accepts of it without the least symptom of sorrow, and no doubt 'twill afford him and his kitchen cabinet a grand and pleasing opportunity to take the responsibility of monopolizing the whole of it." However, this prediction of Jackson and his family eating all of this monstrous cheese didn't come true. In fact, the monster cheese sat in the vestibule of the White House for over a year, until almost the end of Jackson's second term in 1837. Then, a notice appeared in the Washington Globe in mid-February and was reprinted in several other Washington newspapers. The notice began comparing Jefferson's cheese with the Jackson cheese, pointing out how much bigger the later cheese was compared to the former. Then it goes on to announce, "We understand the President designs to offer this great cheese, which is finely flavoured and in fine preservation, to his fellow citizens who visit him on Wednesday next. Mr. Jefferson's cheese was the banquet of the East Room in its unfinished state. The New York present will be served up in the hall of the President's mansion." Jackson chose the 22nd of February, George Washington's birthday, as the date for eating the cheese. Journalist Benjamin Perley Poore described the event like this: "For hours did a crowd of men, women and boys hack at the cheese, many taking large hunks of it away with them. When they commenced, the cheese weighed 1,400 pounds, and only a small piece was saved for the President's use. The air was redolent with cheese, the carpet was slippery with cheese, and nothing else was talked about at Washington that day. Even the scandal about the wife of the President's Secretary of War was forgotten in the tumultuous jubilation of the great occasion." The whole event sounds like it made an awful mess of the White House vestibule. You could say the whole thing was very cheesy. Another journalist gave a somewhat mixed appraisal of the cheese itself in the Alexandria Gazette. "The mammoth cheese was cut and distributed upon this occasion. If the entire cheese was as savoury in proportion as the slice which a friend sent us, it could not have been very agreeable in a crowded room." However, what I think is the best description of the event comes from the Litchfield Enquirer of March 2nd, 1837, describing the events of February the 22nd. "This is Washington's birthday, you know. The President, the departments, the Senate, and we, who are mightier than all, we, the people, I mean, have celebrated it by eating a big cheese. The President's house was thrown open. The multitude swarmed in. The Senate of the United States was adjourned. The secretaries of the various departments turned out. Representatives in squadrons left the capital, and all for the purpose of eating cheese. Yes, all for the purpose of eating cheese. Cheese, cheese, cheese was on everybody's mouth. All you heard was cheese. All you saw was cheese. All you smelt was cheese. It was cheese, cheese, cheese. Streams of cheese were going up in the avenue in everybody's fists. Balls of cheese were in 100 pockets. Every handkerchief smelt of cheese. The whole atmosphere for half a mile around was infected with cheese. I did not see this monstrous cheese at all. I met its fragments in many fists upon the avenue as I ran down. I snuffed it in every breeze. I rushed with the crowd to get a bit, and even with a look I would have been content. But alas, unhappy me, I got no cheese. And that was the end of the second enormous cheese gifted to a sitting president of the United States. As far as I'm aware, since Jackson's presidency, the practice of making oversized cheeses as gifts for the president has not become a regular occurrence. I did find mention of Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, being gifted a large cheese. It was about half the size of Jackson's cheese, but I couldn't discover for sure whether he was given it during his own presidency or if it was at the same time Jackson received his, as Van Buren was his vice president. Being given it while he was vice president seems to make more sense to me. Whichever is the case, he chose a simpler way of disposing it. He had the cheese placed in a local store where pieces were sold to benefit a local charity. That's definitely better than leaving it in the hall for over a year and then inviting the whole city around to help you eat it because you have to move out soon. So those are the stories of the two huge cheeses gifted to Jefferson and Jackson while they were President of the United States. Basically, their supporters thought that a gigantic cheese was the best way to show their appreciation to their leader, and it was worth the effort of figuring out how to make it and transport it hundreds of miles to the White House. All that effort at least partially explains why no one has decided to repeat the feat anytime since. Let me know in the comments if you think this is a practice that should be revived. Perhaps not just for presidents, but for other heads of government and heads of state. Maybe a large cheese for the Queen or for the Prime Minister. If you enjoyed this story of huge cheeses being delivered to the White House, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to Cheese History to learn more about the history of cheese. I'd also like to thank my small and very dedicated group of patrons for their support. You are amazing. If you'd like to support Cheese History, head over to Patreon, link in the description. Have an amazing day, and if you're in the Washington area, keep an eye out for monstrous cheeses.